Johnny Cash was halfway through the second verse when something went wrong in the room. Not with the band, not with the sound, with the audience. The studio lights were blinding, flattening everything past the first few rows into shadow. But Cash had been on enough stages to feel when a crowd shifted before he could see it. A ripple, a pause, the kind that meant attention had snapped to something else. Someone was on their feet. And they weren't leaving, they were moving straight toward the stage. It was a live taping for a television special in Los Angeles, spring of 1972. 300 people in the audience, cameras positioned around the stage, a full band behind Cash. He was performing a song he'd added to his set recently, a ballad about loss and grief that had resonated with audiences. Beautiful melody, heartbreaking lyrics, the kind of song that made people lean forward in their seats. Cash kept singing, but his attention shifted slightly. The figure was moving up the center aisle now, and people were turning to look. The audience was starting to notice. Then Cash saw who it was. Roy Orbison. Cash's voice didn't falter, but something in his chest tightened. Roy was walking slowly, deliberately, his face unreadable behind those dark glasses he always wore. Audience members recognized him too. A few whispered. Some moved aside to let him pass. But Roy didn't acknowledge any of them. He just kept walking toward the stage. Cash reached the chorus. His band was playing perfectly, unaware of what was happening in the audience. The cameras were still on Cash, capturing his performance. Everything looked normal, except it wasn't. Roy reached the front of the stage. He stopped, and he just stood there, looking up at Johnny Cash. Cash finished the chorus, started the third verse, but his eyes kept drifting to Roy, standing motionless at the foot of the stage. Roy's face was still, no anger, no emotion that Cash could read, just presence. And then Roy did something that made Cash's voice catch. He stepped onto the stage. Not rushed, not aggressive, just a slow, steady climb up the side stairs. The audience went completely quiet. The band noticed now. The drummer missed a beat. The guitarist glanced back, confused, but nobody stopped playing. They didn't know what else to do. Roy walked across the stage, directly to Johnny Cash, and he stopped right in front of him. Cash's voice trailed off mid-word. The band kept playing for 2 more bars before they realized what was happening and let the music fade into silence. 300 people in that studio didn't move, didn't breathe. The cameras stayed on, capturing every second of this unscripted moment. Roy Orbison stood 3 feet from Johnny Cash and said nothing. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Cash held the microphone at his side, looking at Roy, waiting. The silence in that studio was so complete you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Finally, Roy spoke. His voice was quiet, but in that silence, it carried to every corner of the room. "That's not your story to tell, John." Cash's face changed. Something in his expression collapsed. Roy continued, still quiet, still calm. "It's mine, and you're turning it into entertainment." Cash opened his mouth. No words came out. He tried again. Nothing. The audience was frozen. Some of them didn't understand what was happening, but they understood enough to know they were witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen, something real breaking through the performance. Roy stood there, looking at Cash, waiting for a response that didn't come. Then Roy turned and walked off the stage. Not quickly, not dramatically, just the same slow, steady walk he'd used to get there. Back down the stairs, back up the center aisle, and out of the studio. The door closed behind him, and Johnny Cash stood alone on that stage, holding a microphone, unable to move. 10 seconds passed. 15. The cameras kept rolling. The audience didn't know what to do. A few people started to applaud uncertainly, but it died almost immediately.
It was the wrong response, and everyone knew it. Cash looked down at the microphone in his hand. Then he set it on the stand, turned, and walked off the stage without saying a word. The taping ended there. The producer came out and told the audience there had been a technical issue and they could leave. People filed out slowly, whispering to each other, trying to understand what they'd just seen. Backstage, Johnny Cash sat alone in his dressing room. His band members stood in the hallway, uncertain whether to go in. The producer knocked once. Cash didn't answer. After a while, everyone just left him there. What nobody in that audience knew, what the cameras didn't capture, was the story behind Roy Orbison's words. Roy Orbison had lived through tragedy that most people couldn't imagine. In 1966, his wife, Claudette, died in a motorcycle accident. She was 25 years old. 2 years later, in 1968,
It wasn't Roy's song. Cash hadn't written it about Roy, but every word, every line, every emotion in that song, Roy had lifted. And hearing someone else sing it, hearing someone perform that pain like it was just another ballad, something beautiful and sad but ultimately distant, it was more than Roy could take. Roy had sat in that audience listening to Cash sing about grief like it was poetry, like it was something you could wrap in a melody and share with strangers. But Roy knew better. Grief wasn't beautiful. It was waking up every morning and forgetting for 3 seconds that your sons were gone, and then remembering. It was hearing a child laugh in a restaurant and feeling your chest cave in. It was living in a world that kept moving forward while you stayed trapped in the moment everything stopped. And watching someone perform that, package it, make an audience feel something for 3 minutes before they went home and forgot about it, that's when Roy stood up. So he'd stood up, and he'd walked onto that stage, and he'd said what needed to be said. That's not your story to tell, it's mine. The footage from that taping never aired. The network decided it was too uncomfortable, too raw. But word spread through the music industry. People who'd been there told the story, and within a few weeks, everyone who mattered knew what had happened. Some people thought Roy had been wrong, that he'd overreacted, that performers sing about pain all the time and it doesn't mean they've lived it. Others understood exactly why Roy had done it. They knew the difference between singing about grief and carrying it, between performing loss and surviving it. Johnny Cash never defended himself. He never explained what happened. When people asked, he just said, Roy had his reasons. But people close to Cash noticed something after that night. That song, the one he'd been singing when Roy walked on stage, disappeared from his set lists. He never performed it again. Not on television, not in concerts, not anywhere. Years later, a journalist asked Cash about his song selection process, how he decided what to perform and what to leave out. Cash thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Some songs belong to the people who lived them. You can admire those songs, you can respect them, but you can't claim them." The journalist asked if he was talking about any song in particular. Cash didn't answer directly. He just said, "Roy Orbison taught me something important once, about the difference between art and life, about what we have the right to sing about and what we don't." What did he teach you? That just because you can perform someone's pain doesn't mean you should. The journalist pressed, "Did something happen between you and Roy?"
Cash was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Roy Orbison lived through more tragedy than most people could survive, and he turned it into some of the most beautiful music ever made. But that was his choice, his right, not mine. That was all Cash ever said about it publicly. But privately, to people he trusted, Cash talked about that night more openly. He described standing on that stage, seeing Roy walk toward him, knowing something was wrong but not knowing what. He described the moment Roy spoke those words and how Cash had felt everything inside him go still. "I knew he was right," Cash said once to a close friend. "The second he said it, I knew. I'd been singing about something I hadn't earned the right to sing about, and Roy had every right to call me on it." "But you didn't write the song about him," the friend said. "No," Cash agreed, "but I was using his pain. Everyone knew what Roy had been through, and when I sang that song, people thought about him, about what he'd lost. I was taking his tragedy and turning it into my performance, and that wasn't right." Cash paused, looking down at his hands. "You know what the worst part was? I'd convinced myself I was honoring people like Roy, that by singing about loss, I was giving voice to grief. But Roy showed me the difference between giving voice to something and taking it. I was taking his story and making it mine, and he had every right to stop me." Roy Orbison and Johnny Cash didn't speak for almost a year after that night, not because of anger, not because of any public falling out, just because some things are too heavy to address directly. Some wounds need space. When they finally did talk, it was brief. They ran into each other at a recording studio in Nashville. Roy was coming out as Cash was going in. They stood there for a moment. Then Cash said, "Roy, about that night." Roy shook his head. "You don't need to explain, John." "I want to. I know you do, but you don't need to. You understood. That's enough." Cash nodded. They shook hands, and that was it. They remained friendly after that, professional, respectful, but something had shifted. There was a distance that hadn't been there before. Not hostility, just an acknowledgement of boundaries, of what belonged to whom. In 1988, Roy Orbison died of a heart attack at the age of 52. When Johnny Cash heard the news, he canceled his appearances for a week. People who saw him during that time said he was quieter than usual, more.
But what Cash thought about, what he carried with him from that day, was a moment on a stage in 1972 when Roy Orbison had walked through an audience and told him a truth that Johnny Cash needed to hear. That some pain belongs to the people who lived it, and the rest of us can only witness it, respect it, but never claim it. Years later, long after both men were gone, someone who'd been in that studio audience wrote about what they'd seen. They described the silence, the tension, the way Johnny Cash had frozen when Roy spoke to him, the way the whole room had held its breath. "I didn't understand it at the time," the person wrote. "I thought it was just some backstage drama playing out in public. But years later, when I learned about Roy's life, about what he'd lost, I understood. He wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't making a scene. He was drawing a line, protecting something that belonged to him." The person continued, and Johnny Cash, to his credit, respected that line. He didn't fight it. He didn't defend himself. He just stopped. And that takes a kind of strength that's rare. The footage from that taping still exists somewhere in a network vault, but it's never been released. People who've seen it say it's one of the most powerful moments ever captured on camera. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Because sometimes the most important exchanges happen in silence, in the space between words, in the moment when someone tells you a truth you don't want to hear but desperately need to understand. Roy Orbison told Johnny Cash that truth on a stage in Los Angeles in 1972, and Cash spent the rest of his life honoring it, not by apologizing, not by explaining, but by never singing that song again. Because that was Roy's story, Roy's pain, Roy's right to decide who could tell it and how. And Johnny Cash, for all his legendary status, understood that some things are bigger than performance, bigger than art, bigger than the audience's desire to be moved.
Some things belong to the people who survived them, and the rest of us can only listen. That's what Roy Orbison taught Johnny Cash on a spring night in 1972, and Cash never forgot it.